international cooperation activities. Would anyone have any feedback? I mean, like, it's time to, or any question on this subject? In that case, like, we will go forward in your presentation, and I invite to stage Victor Alvarez, senior economist at UNCTAD, like globalization and strategic development division. He is specialized in multilateral diplomacy and the role of financial system in the international cooperation. Hello, Victor. Give you mic that will work.
Well, I have to say, can you hear me well? Good. Oh, I see many friendly, well-known faces from many years of diplomatic work, also in the Secretariat. I might say that Ana Maria would have not done a better introduction, since you could say I'm also from Latin America, place in the world where I very much develop my fundamental experiences of life. And essentially, I think part of my presentation has very much to do with Ana Maria at the end was addressing, which has to do with the multilateral challenges for compromising and for building lasting agreements. And in this regard, I'll mention 3 ideas that you might think about it and that you might link substantive elements which are in the presentation to try to find a solution to these 3 challenges that happened in the past. 2009, the Nairobi outcome was being negotiated in New York, and EU and G77 were close to voting on the outcome and having no landmark agreement or essential basis for South-South cooperation. Discussion was, what's South-South cooperation? What is the principle? What is the framework? For 77, the word solidarity and complementarity, and based on their history, was fundamental core of it. For European Union and others, it was the consistency with practices, very much a result of many years of development cooperation, North-South cooperation, and they wanted that consistency and accountability for their taxpayers at home. Fundamentally, 2 very different approaches. And I think what is beautiful about multilateral diplomacy is that there's a human factor, and human factor brings trust sometimes. And I think what's going to be a challenge again, the decisions are very much the same. In 2009, there was the prudence of avoiding not having a platform or not having the UN engage in South-South. Would have been a terrible loss. But it was very close, particularly of the concept, the definition of South-South. That's coming again. I'm going to talk about that. So then the concept. Then in 2015, it's facilitating the General Assembly resolution on South-South cooperation. And the question came again, institutional arrangements. Should it be inside of the UN? Should it be outside? If it is inside of the UN, according to regular budget. If it is a fundamental issue of the international arena and of the importance of member states, why should not have the proper resource institutional arrangements to be provided to it? But then it comes the question of, posted in UNDP, on the development cooperation framework, on the Busan partnership umbrella, or based on the principles defined by developing countries as very much China, Brazil, India and South Africa and many other developed countries advocated for. Even within the developing countries, there are challenges in terms of like some, like the specific UN development system ability to deliver on the ground, in terms of the ability to deliver in terms of projects. And this, of course, is an ongoing conversation, which is very much something that is related to what I'm trying to add value to, which is to the 2019 conference that will be happening in Buenos Aires as commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Buenos Aires Plan of Action. So I think this is a great opportunity, and I would like to congratulate the organizers, and I'll post into my speech. Since I come from multilateral diplomacy, you'll forgive me that I'll share with you one of the bad habits of multilateral diplomats and then also a speech. Which I think it's necessary, since I'm going to be sharing very much research developed by colleagues at ACTED on the Division of Globalization, very much under the leadership of the Division Director, Rachel Kosovo. So there's a very large team of colleagues which do ongoing research, and I wanted to bring the best I could bring, and that includes not only my views, but also the views of my colleagues. And to be fair with them, I also believe, because it doesn't mean I'll be with you. So having said so, and pointing these elements, I said, the 209 dilemma in terms of the identity and the principles of how the 213 dilemma about where do we place it in terms of the institutional arrangements. And regarding the 2018 dilemmas, well, you know very much, very well. It's the new agenda, it's universal in nature. Developing countries determined that we cannot lose the common but different responsibilities, the historical perspective, and the responsibility that came from, colonialism and so on. And of course, what's the role of the private sector vis-a-vis official development assistance and official flows like the RDA? Who is going to really mobilize the resources? And I have a tremendous colleague in ANCTAD researching on this in terms of private sector and different options in that scenario. But I think on the member state discussion, the challenge is going to be, will they be able to continue contributing, because of course the government financing, it's a multiplier, and I think you can figure it out alone with the private sector contribution. But let me go then to the speech. I'd love to do this to change my plan. So, distinguished delegates, panelists, colleagues of the United Nations system, ladies and gentlemen. So I thank already Africa 21, Julian Chambol and Maria Alvarez for the organization of the event. As I said before, it's a special honor to be here with you. And I hope this will serve as inspiration to move ahead collectively while remembering the important moment we are going through, full of challenges for developing countries and for Africa. Now we are entering the 2018 early preparations, discussions, and informal consultations on South-South cooperation. This will happen in various forums. This is just one. To discuss policy recommendations to be agreed later at the highest level. All this on occasion of the 40th anniversary of Buenos Aires Plan of Action. So I think I mentioned this before, but let me further detail it. I will summarize some central messages resulting of the high-level symposium on South-South cooperation happened in Buenos Aires last fall. I'll also address some aspects of ANCTAD research about the future of South-South cooperation, including the global economic scenario, challenges for developing countries, and of course ANCTAD 14, its implementation, and what's the future of South-South cooperation from an ANCTAD perspective and from the perspective of the possible role of the organization. I hope all of this will fit in 15 minutes. So in terms of giving a brief background on ANCTAD's work, so the discussion on promoting South-South cooperation through trade dates back to the 1940s, when the development of countries emerging from the colonial era began to gain importance as an international policy objective. Raoul Prebisch, in his report to the first UNCTAD, our founding Secretary General, argued in support of increased South-South trade as part of a new trade policy for development. In 1978, UNCTAD Secretary General, Germani Correa, said that economic cooperation among developing countries is a subject that figures prominently on the agenda of UNCTAD. So this process constitutes a major dimension of international developmental policy, providing support of the process of ECDC in a manner that will facilitate negotiations among these countries against a wider background of a universal endorsement of the process by the international community as a whole. This, I think, hasn't changed in principle, but I'm convinced always going to the source. And to me, there's no better source about the DNA of UNCTAD than Prebisch in Korea. Then the global situation. So the GDP in the South, which represent about 20% of the world GDP between the early 1970s and the late 1990s, has doubled to about 40% of global GDP by 2012, with China alone accounting for 12% of global GDP. And most of global growth is now a result of growth among developing countries and transition economies. So the southern share of global trade has also grown tremendously, increasing from 35% in 2000 to 51% in 2012. There has also been a switch in the composition of developing country exports away from the primary exports and resource-based manufacturers towards medium and high technology goods. Between 1990 and 2014, the share of high and medium technology goods in developing country merchandise exports increased from 27 to 42%. However, the pace of trade growth has significantly slowed in recent years. Between 2012 and 2014, world merchandise trade grew between 2 and 2.5%, which is very similar to the global output growth rates. Significantly below also the average annual rate of 7.2% recorded from the 2003 to 2007 period. So this decline poses potential challenges for traditional export-led growth and industrialization strategies linked to growing consumer demand in the north. Then increasing South-South and interregional trade, I think, offers a promising alternative. In 2015, an idea of this, 2/3 of developing country merchandise trade was South-South trade, up from just 1/3 in 1990. I wish everything was good news, but there's some challenges out there. And it's very much linked to what the TDR dedicated itself this year. And this, I think it's a tremendous outcome that collectively the division has come out. Addressing the current iteration of the economic environment for developing countries and systemic challenges which are in place. So there's not that much to be optimistic. So the failure of growth in many developed countries to regain its pre-crisis momentum, despite several years of accommodative monetary policy, as the Federal Reserve and the Central Bank, has created what UNCTAD calls a new abnormal. In today's financialized world, stimulating the economy relies unduly on mounting debt and asset bubbles, with countries facing a difficult trade-off between prolonged subdued growth and financial stability. So this global economic environment has created economic challenges for developing countries. In light of these challenges, new multilateral agreements, such as multilateral exchange rate management or a greater role for special drawing rights, are urgently needed. I encourage you to look at the 2009 outcome on the financial crisis. It has some interesting language, special drawing rights, very much in line with what Keynes originally proposed, and it's on the IMF Articles of Agreement. Of course, it's pending for full implementation. So their adoption through requires institutional changes that appear out of reach in the immediate future. Foreign currency swap arrangements can offer a way forward, but These have mainly catered to the needs of developed countries. Such swaps involving developing countries are still relatively limited. Expanding internationally monetary fund loan facilities would also help, but so far, new arrangements have largely remained untapped. Meeting the needs of developing countries requires reform of the International Monetary Fund, governance, policy orientation, and surveillance mechanisms. A preferred option for developing countries may be to proactively build on a series of regional and interregional initiatives that aim to foster regional macroeconomic and financial stability, reduce the need for foreign exchange accumulation as insurance, and strengthen resilience and capabilities to deal with balance of payment crisis. In a diverse international community, strong regional initiatives could be productively combined with other global, regional, and national institutions to create a better governance systems. Such a combination of initiatives at various levels could at least partially provide an alternative to reserve accumulation, thereby serving as a stepping stone to more comprehensive international monetary reform in the future. Since I'm taking longer than what I originally expected, I think I'll skip a section. I just will encourage you to look at the TDR 2017. There's this extraordinary section. It's almost pure poetry. It's just wonderful. It just starts like, across the heartland of America and beyond, the world economy remains rooted in a state of substandard growth, while the social and economic inequalities exposed by the crisis show few signs of moderating. You know, I just am passionate about it, but in the sake of time, I just encourage you to look at it. It has no waste. So, moving forward to what I think is the core of our conversation here. So UNCTAD and South-South cooperation. So for 50 years, UNCTAD has been a constant partner for the South-South cooperation. And since its creation, UNCTAD has been at the service of Southern partners, developing countries, amplifying their voice, addressing their needs, and facilitating their collaboration. So now is the time to deepen that partnership. And I say this to the distinguished diplomatic representative of the Global South here. Since creation in 2010 and during the last 7 years, the Unit for Economic Cooperation with developing countries has worked on a number of issues. So global value chains and South-South trade, industrial policy in China and its lessons for other developing countries, regional financial cooperation in Latin America and West Africa, regional value chains in leather and food processing in South Asia, regional value chains in leather and leather processing in Africa, national development banks as an instrument of industrial policy, the new development bank, which my very talented colleague Neil will be addressing. Really glad to say. We're very like to have him. And this is just to show the breadth of issues we're dealing with and the kind of analytical capacity we have in the House. Going forward, our plan is to strengthen the statistical part of our work. Now we'll develop this further in my intervention, counting on the cooperation with the statistics branch. In addition, we're considering the issue of a forum for discussion on some of the topics which have so far been badly neglected. Among these, the most important is a forum to address 8 issues from the perspective of the recipients and donors from the South. Currently, there's no such forum, even though there are many conversations which are ongoing and some, let's say, alternative or proposals before by the OECD. So, if we talk about UNCTAD's work, we always need to reposition ourselves on the latest mandate, which for us would be UNCTAD 14. In that sense, UNCTAD 15 spoke in these terms. So the conference will continue, UNCTAD conference, will continue to contribute to the implementation of and follow up to the outcomes of a relevant global conference, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development we're obviously discussing today, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And here, a note. Initially, the 77, I haven't told this story before. I hope I'm not, I think The 77 originally was not convinced about the conveniency of making the Addis Ababa Action Agenda as the means of implementation for the 2030. 77 developing countries wanted 3 tracks of financing: separate track on climate change, separate track on poverty eradication, and separate track on the FFD would be mostly about the reform of the international financial system, governance, and so on. Of course, you know, in a global recession, the chances that you're going to agree to a several hundred multi-billion-dollar package, it's quite unlikely. So some of us, you know, we had to also deal with the fact that what would be better for global consensus. First, a financing for development conference, and then the global summit on the SDGs, or first the global summit on the SDGs, and then the FFD conference, following out the overall agreement, and then providing the means to achieve it. This idea, first, we thought it was going to be that way. We were going to have the 2030 and then Addis. But the reality is there was fears, lack of trust sometimes in many negotiations, that once the 2030 was agreed without no means to implement it, FFD conference might not happen. And on the other hand, there was certainty that there was not the political will or the ability on OECD member states to put up the commitment financially to finance the agenda. So the better option resulted in, okay, we have a framework which is much larger than the original MDGs or than the SDGs, which is the financing for development outcomes. It's very systemic in nature, trade to debt and so on. You know it very well. So it's a complete systemic picture. So as we know well, if we made the international level more fair and inclusive for developing countries, so if the rules of the game, which is UNCTAD has been advocating for years, are more fair, then the reality is those countries have a real ability to achieve those development goals. And we thought it was better to have a consensus basis and a platform to engage and to continue till a moment where the global financial recession that we were living, even though it was denied, would provide a better framework for building up those commitments. So that's, in a way, part of the story. The other part has to do with multilateral negotiations, part of it I'm not to disclose. But it's how we end up with having the FFD as the means of implementation, which I think theoretically makes sense. Some people might agree or disagree with me. I think my note became quite large, but I think I was just quoting UNCTAD Mondays on Nairobi. You know, but I think an important line there would be, so UNCTAD 14 offer policy options and very much aligning consistency with the Addis outcome and with the 2030. The challenge here is the South-South principles and perspective has never been consistent with Addis principles and framework. It's always been different in nature. So there's going to be a natural tension between trying to align a South-South conference with the 2030 agenda, which has FFD as the means of implementations, because they're different conceptual frameworks. And there's going to be a natural conflict there. And then, of course, we go a little further, and I think I have 3 minutes at least. Very quickly, and so in the DCF, so a wide range of views came out to define further South-South cooperation. However, there was an agreement on the practical orientation to the preparations for the conference in 2019. So the symposium identified 5 areas to further the work, and those are adjusting to the new context of global sustainable development frameworks, knowledge management and knowledge sharing, institutionalization, which includes the idea of creating an international organization for South-South cooperation, which is quite a theme. If you have any question about that, I'll have to answer. Systematization of data and information and capacity development. And some elements that were highlighted as key for South-South, it's the fact that South-South is missing a positive development impact, reducing asymmetries. It can contribute to a new multilateralism and drive the revitalization of a global partnership for sustainable development. That has a strategic opportunity to mobilize science, technology, and innovation as a key means for implementation. That can further advance South-led and multilateral development banks, which has been mentioned, which can collectively play a potential important role in creating and supporting knowledge networks across the South. That's also another part of my intervention I did not spoke about, which is creating this data collection network among southern entities and countries. The same way the OECD does under their Sender principles, there is an initiative that within the South be done on South-South cooperation principles. So if you have interest in that issue, I can elaborate. And I think that one of the last issues that I would point out as a recommendation was that definitely this overall process will contribute to the global financial architecture rethinking with a view to reflect a new reality of the South-South, the emerging South. If you allow me one more minute. So change happens, and change is an opportunity for creativity and innovation. So I was asked to share on the collective view towards the future. And even though it's very hard to identify or to visualize the future, it's impossible. We can say without doubt that the next decade will be central to the reform or transformation of the global economic governance. And regarding the next decade, is that we have observed the trends mentioned before when we address increased systemic challenges faced by developing countries. There are opportunities, and we can certainly affirm that the BRICS development banks is a definite change in the existing landscape and serves an example of the importance of new regional arrangements to reflect new realities. There is also no doubt that there is a greater need and participation of the Global South in global economic governance arrangements and mechanisms, and the UN could facilitate efforts. And this is my final thought. The challenge here, when we talk about South-South cooperation, governance, reform, responsibilities, who made the agenda, it has to do with something a very brilliant diplomatic colleague of mine told me many years ago, which is why the BRICS would step in and pay the bill if they're not entitled to have their legitimate role in the global economic governance structure and to have a part in decision-making on the level of representation that they deserve. So as long as that global governance arrangements are not updated, I mean seriously updated, not like the 210, 211 minor cosmetic changes to the Bretton Woods institutions, voting, voter rights. Only when those arrangements are to reflect the true weight of the South in the global economy, then you could have a conversation about the emerging role of the South in contributing and financing the agenda, but we're not there. And I thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot. A lot of subjects has been talked. If I put it in a nutshell, I would talk about all the implications of UN in this South-South cooperation as a facilitator. And through that, UNCTAD will be a key actor. What would we say? Like the environment has changed, like growth transferred to South, which modified trade balance and also cooperation dynamics, which is today a reality as at the economic level, but which is not a reality at the diplomatic level. So there is big question right now for southern countries is either developing with left and northern capitals, which will bring like different, let's say, difficulties, or let's say same difficulties as before, or to set up monetary solutions to be implemented for a long time but haven't been, to foster regional development, which is pretty hard on different levels, and to be part of global governance in this development. At the end, well, the big thing is like, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there is a big transformation, big step to do, and we are now in the northern countries asking the southern countries to do it without giving them the voice and the place to decide and to be part of the governance that will monitor it. So, am I globally putting it in a nutshell? So, any question about what's the role of the UN and how it, like multilateral diplomacy, will help or promote this development?
One question would be, what would be, you actually mentioned that you would be glad to answer questions on that point on what would be a new organization, if there is a new organization, what would be its interaction and its overlap, possible overlap with UNCTAD and with other organizations that are out there already working on South-South cooperation in other terms, like saying things like the South Center, Partnership for Peoples and Development. So there are several organizations already out there. A new organization, new institutional framework. What would be its interplay with all these and UNCTAD as well?
Well, I think it's the criminal tie, that question. And most likely we'll have to wait till the spring of 2019 to know the answer. It is obviously quite complex in the current scenario with the UN going through annual budget cuts and a major process of streamlining across the system, which is what the SG has proposed, to really embrace the idea of a new international organization. So I think on that plane, I think it's quite not likely. Improbable?
Likely.
Quite unlikely. Sorry. Quite unlikely it might end up happening. I think what member states are coming from this has to do, I think, with the delivery on the ground model. So I think it's not focused on the analytical side of how principle or approaches or how the conceptual framework is defined. So from an active perspective, I don't feel nervous actually. I think it's very much linked to how the UN system arranges itself on the ground. It's linked to the RC model, role of UNDP vis-a-vis other specialized agencies. And I think it has to do more with the discussions that started in 2013 about the role of the Office for South Cooperation and how, even as under the umbrella of UNDP, member states want intellectual autonomy of that office. The role of that office is the focal point within the UN system. They mainly work on technical projects on the ground, and they rely very much on the research we do substantively. So I think that it has to do more with the business model, I think, fundamentally. But I think it's a very important question, and I think everyone should be in a position to contribute to that discussion.
So new actors, new position, maybe some bridge gaps.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Ana Maria, for inviting me to this event. I would like to also congratulate Victor Ovalles it's the first time I meet you, and we are colleagues in UNCTAD, but we are sometimes in silos, you know, in different divisions. I've been in UNCTAD since 2003, when Philip Lusik here hired me, so it's your fault, and together with Ana Maria. So I know more or less the UN system from the perspective of UNCTAD, and from the perspective of how multi-stakeholders have been working together with us for a number of umbrellas. And we most of the time stay in the field. We are here, but we need to work with the member states around the world. And we see this engagement of multi-stakeholders, and your comments are very much in connection to what we have been doing in UNCTAD. You know, in many ways, since all these conferences that I've been since 2004 in Sao Paulo, I saw more and more South-South cooperation, but I would say to be more disaggregated. In my lessons learned is that you need to see also there are more advanced developing countries to these less advanced developing countries, or even this area of LDCs, where of course we're talking about Africa today. Perhaps the majority of LDCs are connected to that continent. I don't have so much experience on Africa, just on North Africa, on the MENA region. And I learned from this experience that these countries cooperate a lot with European countries, but in between themselves, there's very little cooperation. There's very little intra-regional cooperation between them, despite the idea of that they share the same religion, the same some costumes, and also they speak the same language, international Arabic. But then I find in the years I'm doing some work for this region that there's very little in terms of themselves. You know, so what we did, we used some tools that we have in UNCTAD. And in our branch, in the trade division, we have in our division, there is a branch that deals with competition and consumer policies. So what we try to see is how competition and consumer policies are actually a tool for regional economic integration, using the European model and so forth. Now, in my humble experience to that particular area, I see that South-South cooperation goes in this area, you know, of less developed countries trying to find some ways to interact with more advanced countries, let alone the facts of other regions, like, for example, Latin America, you mentioned several times, and Ana Maria, where Brazil, Mexico are trying to actually fight for the lead of Latin America. The same way in Africa, with South Africa and other big countries that are trying to find the way of leading the regional agenda. In the area of competition, you have the African Competition Forum. So now all is nice and all is good. But then when I read the UN report of 2017, in May 2017 of the SDGs, and they looked at the analysis of each SDGs, that you're very much aware, you mentioned the agenda, they say, and they compare directly between LDCs statistics and developed country statistics. And they actually, I don't know, maybe it's our colleagues from DESA who writes this paper, but they actually missed the line between what is happening in this dynamic world of BRICS, you mentioned it, and the more advanced developing countries that are taking the path. Now, the idea of this is that, and I finish with this comment, is that why not looking into this area in which we disaggregate the South-South cooperation, and we move towards the idea of having less advanced countries working together with more advanced countries on specific topics that are of interest, common interest between what we actually think in policymakers at the local level, and not just, you know, thinking about what they would say and that we need, because that's something that happened. You know, and last example was when we were trying to deal for years, more than 10 years, a cooperation between Chile, Colombia, and Peru on an area that they didn't want to cooperate, which is sharing confidential information between competition cases. But it was only until Chile, the head of the Chilean authority, they said, wait, this is a push from our companies to talk about cartels that are being originated in Colombia and are impacting in Chile. I need that cooperation. The same thing between Switzerland and European Union. But otherwise, there's no move. In the SADC region, there's a lot of areas where they're actually working together on sharing information. But until there's not a real need to do that, most of summits and international agreements and official agreements will not make any change.
Okay, so let's say basically SDGs might be an opportunity to create a cluster of South-South cooperation on actual matters that do matter on the ground. And let's say not to compare the least advanced, or to make it simple, North and South, and focus through SDGs on the issues and the matters and the issues that does matter in the South more than the issues that does matter for the North, according to on the South area. You want to add something?
No, just to thank the intervention, quite rich and fruitful. Yeah, there's a lot of studies about the little intra-cooperation among African countries. You might say that it's related to colonialism and the design, and also the structure of the commodity markets and how where those exports are destined. But yeah, very much the new agenda for the SDGs focus on infrastructure on Africa for that very much reason, and I think there have been very interesting studies about even the lack of airline connection among African countries, which difficult very much trade and flow of investment and technology. Regarding the usefulness of conferences, UN conference as well, UNCTAD is an ongoing conference, so I always like to be optimist and think that they're relevant and they add value. I do think that they add value because in their absence, it's anarchy, I think, and chaos. And some people like anarchy and chaos. I like to try to do the effort towards something more harmonic, at least do the attempt, do the effort. And I think particularly for us in the Secretariat, the implication is we do operate on the basis of intergovernmental mandates. If we don't update our own internal view of issues, essentially they start growing out outside of the organization, like what happened with the Busan platform on development effectiveness. I am not opposing it, not endorsing it. I'm just simply saying it's a process happening outside of the UN and the General Assembly. And then when that discussion happens inside, it's a relevant discussion. So same with South-South. It's a conversation I would not like it to leave the UN system. And I think that's the relevance of the conference. And I think the only thing that will bridge the gap among member states' different views and national interest will be evidence, research-based evidence. And I think that's why the UN system, and particularly UNCTAD, and I invite all my colleagues from all divisions to contribute. I think it's going to be very important.
Let's create data. We need data in the South. Yeah? Last question, and then we take a coffee break. Lady.
Okay. Does it move this much?
Yeah, you want to.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Annie. I come from Madagascar. Since I've been listening from many lenses, from Latin America and from UNCTAD lenses, what is the perspective for Africa to move forward to reach the gap and to reach to how to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, especially number 17. Allow me just maybe to thank Mrs. Maria and Mr. Ovales for the quality of the presentation. And I would like to pick maybe my intervention, one reflection and two questions from what was said by Mr. Ovales. Change happens. From that point, I would like maybe to put on the table, to push the reflection on what is definitely changing since last 30 days, maybe, or maybe like 6 months. A new president of AU is elected. This is now chaired by the President Kagame from Rwanda. He was defining the main objective of his mandate, and the roadmap is, first of all, to conclude the CFTA. Second, to lead the free movement, and you just launched the First Alliance Transport, unique First Alliance Transport for Africa. So that was happening like 15 days ago. In our perspective as well, what is on the table is the Road and Belt Initiative, of course. Despite many reflections, converging or diverging, it can also put on the table to think about how to move forward to bridge the gap in terms of infrastructures, and also to maybe promote all the regional cooperation in Africa. From those perspectives, my question is, how, in UNCTAD perspective, to definitely maybe to look from this lens to the actual lens, not the framework, how UNCTAD was created 60 years ago or 70 years, yeah, but just to think of how definitely in terms of the diplomacy, multilateral at that level, diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy, and definitely the link with the public, the private sectors, because this is the key. How to reach there, to make things happen, because the need is to make an impact with those perspectives. So I've been listening about how can be difficult from the decision-making process, because it's all involving diplomacy and also governments, but maybe to find the way to think through what is the dynamic, and to more maybe put involving private. I come from both sides, public and private, so I can see what maybe from a humble level what is the problem when you come from the public, and to try to inform the private or to connect the private. Maybe there is something to do there to push the reflection on that side. Thank you.
So alors, to put it like, let's say, what are the axes to for more involvement, shareholder, stakeholder involvement, private sector especially. We have seen some change in African Union recently with the access to President of His Majesty, His Honorable whatever, Paul Kagame, a good friend of mine. He's a man of his mandate, so we will see what will change, but we know also when we look at this institution that it has been a lot of inertia. So things will change, we will check on that. Let's say if we want to make things happen on the field, there is first a common vision to set up, and that's the role, I think, of the UNCTAD and of the negotiations that are going on. And then there is like simplification and implication of the process and different stakeholders, which means once you have defined an objective, you need to go to make it happen on the floor, and to make it happen, we will see that later. You need money, you need team, you need programs, and you need them to work as one towards the objective. What I propose to you is like we make a short break, coffee break, like 5 minutes. Then we come back here and we will go on the next discussion with Mrs. Riba, which will present us with the South-South Cooperation Synergy. I propose, if you want to talk about all these subjects,